Early philosophy encountered a strict limit. Figuring out what the universe is physically made of, charting the movement of matter and elements, does not tell a human being how they ought to live. To bridge that gap, thinkers had to stop looking upward at the stars and start looking inward. This pivot marked the discovery of being, and with it, the birth of moral philosophy. Shifting focus from the cosmos to the self meant realizing that human behavior couldn't simply rely on local habits. It demanded a rigorous, objective standard to judge right from wrong. Socrates forced this issue. Instead of accepting Athenian social conventions, he stopped citizens to demand precise definitions for concepts like justice and piety. That relentless questioning made him incredibly unpopular. Treating morality as an objective truth to be discovered, rather than a tradition to be blindly obeyed, put him on a direct collision course with the political realities of his time. The Socratic method demonstrated a harsh mechanical reality. Without a clearly defined internal moral compass, any human endeavor lacks direction. It was his student Plato who took this internal moral quest and scaled it to the level of civilizational design. In his masterwork, The Republic, Plato confronts a cynical argument, the idea that justice is simply whatever benefits the people currently holding power. To prove that justice has independent value, Plato constructs a theoretical city in Stich, Callipolis, so he can observe how justice operates on a macro scale. He bases this model on the concept of structural isomorphism. He argues that there is an exact mechanical correspondence between a single human soul and an entire political state. For Plato, justice cannot be a checklist of external laws. It requires a specific hierarchical architecture of internal forces, an architecture that must be identical in both the citizen and the city. We can map this architecture directly. The three parts of the human soul corresponds perfectly to the three classes of Plato's ideal city. At the base, we have the appetitive soul. This is the drive for food, wealth, and comfort. In the city, it maps to the artisan and farmer class. The appetitive class is strictly necessary for survival and economic production, yet by its nature, it is blind to the long-term good of the whole system. Above that is the spirited soul, driven by honor, emotion, and courage. This corresponds to the auxiliary or military class. The spirited tier acts as the enforcer. It provides the willpower needed to resist base appetites, but it only functions correctly if it receives proper direction. At the apex is the rational soul, driven exclusively by truth and wisdom. In the city, this is the guardian class, the ultimate rulers. Reason possesses a unique mechanical capability. It is the only element equipped to exercise foresight and calculate what genuinely benefits the entire tripartite system. This gives us the definition of Platonic justice. Justice exists if and only if this exact hierarchy holds. Reason actively governs, relying on spirit for enforcement, to manage and contain the endless demands of appetite. If the rational tier must rule, a vital question emerges. What prevents those rulers from imposing their own subjective opinions and becoming tyrants themselves? The system requires an ultimate epistemic anchor. Plato calls this the form of the good, a transcendent, objective standard of truth and value existing outside the material world. Plato draws a strict line here between mere opinion, which relies on the flawed assumptions of the physical world, and true knowledge, which is the direct apprehension of these eternal forms. A ruler without access to the form of the good is flying blind. They are forced to govern based on guesswork, shifting public sentiment, or personal greed. This theoretical ideal stood in stark contrast to the historical reality of Athens. The Athenian Empire was built on naval expansion and material wealth, rather than on philosophical truth. True political authority is entirely dependent on philosophical education. Without an epistemic anchor located outside the political system, the system will eventually consume itself. This logic leads to the apex of the Republic, the Philosopher King. It is a highly specific condition where supreme political power and supreme philosophical wisdom perfectly coincide in the same person. This creates an immediate paradox. Because the philosopher's ultimate desire is oriented upward toward the eternal form of the good, they view the physical world of politics as a shadow-filled distraction. Leadership is not a privilege, it is a burden. The philosopher must be compelled to turn away from the light and descend back into the metaphorical cave to manage the city's affairs. That extreme reluctance is exactly what qualifies them to rule. They are uniquely immune to the corrupting gravity of wealth, status, and power because they assign those things zero value. Compare this to a traditional, ambitious politician who actively campaigns for power specifically to satisfy their own ego and appetites. In Plato's architecture, the only people who can be trusted with absolute power are those who consider holding it to be a massive, unavoidable burden. We can test this model by running it in reverse. We have to look at what happens when a society rejects the philosopher king and the tripartite hierarchy falls out of alignment. In a democracy, the golden rational tier is removed. The red appetitive tier rapidly expands to absorb the structure, prioritizing unregulated equality. The democratic citizen psychology mirrors this flat grid. They treat all desires as equally valid, refusing to let reason prioritize them. Translated to political reality, a populace governed by appetite will inevitably elect leaders who flatter their lowest desires rather than those leaders who demand virtue. Many celebrated historical leaders functioned exactly as enablers of this imperial appetite, expanding the city's power and wealth while entirely neglecting its moral core. Democracy harbors a fatal systemic vulnerability. Without a baseline of rational self-governance among the citizens, the system defaults to the lowest common denominator. This sets up the final stage of Plato's regime cycle. A chaotic, appetite-driven democracy naturally gives way to tyranny. A tyrant inevitably emerges by promising to restore order and deliver the people's desires, only to ultimately consume the state. Let us look at the tyrant's internal psychology. They are the exact inverse of the philosopher. Their soul is completely enslaved to its most monstrous, unquenchable appetites. The tyrant's absolute power is an illusion. While they appear to exercise absolute control over the city, they actually live in a state of absolute terror, dependency, and anxiety. Tyranny is the manifestation of the appetitive soul, completely untethered from reason, a condition that inevitably destroys both the individual and the state. This brings us back to the absolute necessity of structural isomorphism. A city can never be more just, more stable, or more rational than the internal souls of the citizens who populate it. This is why the philosopher king, or a rigorous philosophical education, is not a utopian dream. It is a mechanical prerequisite for survival. We cannot engineer a just society through laws, institutions, or blind voting alone. True political order is entirely downstream of psychological order. We have to rationally govern our own lives before we have any hope of governing the city.